Up first is Jody Garnett and Anthony Palomino. Outstanding. Presenting Understanding Open Source. So applause first or afterwards? What do you guys say? Both.
Woo!
All right. Take it away, Bob.
Get it started off right. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for attending. We appreciate it. I'm going to talk a little bit today about open source licensing and how that applies to whether you are creating commercial software, whether you're using it in an operational setting. What are the disclaimers? What are things you need to know about? What licenses do we use? A lot of people have a lot of questions and feel that open source licensing is very mysterious. And so the point of our talk today is basically to kind of demystify open source licensing and how it can be used in an operational environment. My name is Anthony Calamito. I'm the VP of Product for Boundless. We're an open source geospatial software company. We leverage open source licensing very heavily. So we're going to talk hopefully from a position of understanding and experience on how all this stuff plays out. I have a pretty decent background within the open source community, but certainly nothing compared to my co-presenter here, Jody Garnett. Jody's our community lead. He's deeply involved in several open source foundations, both the Eclipse Foundation as well as the Open Source Geospatial Foundation. And so again, hopefully some of the background that we have, experiences we have, you guys can learn from and take away today. We, Boundless, create an open source GIS ecosystem. That ecosystem is very heavily reliant and powered upon the best of breed open source GIS technologies that live in the world today. And what we're beginning to do is we're beginning to realize that there's a need for folks to want to have both open source software in terms of the project, coupled with commercial support and maintenance so that they can use that open source technology in an operational environment, right? I want to be able to pick up a phone when there's a problem. I want to have a throat to choke, as we say in the military world, right? When something goes wrong. Open source is great, but my fear of using it has always been that it's not really supported the way I need it to be to rely on it in a 24/7 operational setting. So Boundless exists in the same way Red Hat, another very local company, works by supporting the open source version of Linux. We work and we live and exist to support the open source geospatial software that exists by providing support, maintenance, training, and many other aspects. Open source continues to grow, and you don't take my word for it. This is just Google search for two very popular GIS desktop software platforms over the last couple of years. You can see QGIS at the bottom there, the open source desktop GIS. It's trending much higher relatively than some of the commercial technologies that have been around for 40 years. People are interested in using open source. It has the scalability. There is no commercial licensing or per seat licensing. I can scale up or out as much as I need to in order to get my mission done. But again, questions remain around, is open source approved to use in my environment? Can I use it? What are the stipulations I need to be concerned about? So I point out here a couple different pieces of information for you to take back to your constituency. First is back in 2009, the DoD CIO released a memorandum of understanding that talked about how it's okay to use open source software on your existing systems and in your network, provided that you had commercial support and maintenance for it. So if something did go wrong, you had the ability to call somebody, get a bug fix put in, understand what's broken, right? What's involved in that software packaging? What am I getting when I install it? Those are the types of questions they want you to be able to ask. And so the DoD said, we'll let you use open source, it's just got to have that commercial support and maintenance for it. The White House and Tony Scott, the U.S. Chief Information Officer, also sent out a memo saying, yep, we agree with what DoD's put in place, and we're going to take it a step further. You have a fiscal responsibility to see if an open source solution works first. If it doesn't, by all means, we'll go ahead and pay for your proprietary option. But you've got to do due diligence to try and have fiscal responsibility in what you do. And so his memorandum talks about the transparency, efficiency, and innovation of open source, and that you should try to use that first whenever possible. There are links here to those two documents at the bottom. When we do release the slides, which I do believe we're going to do, you'll be able to pull those up. As a result, there is this shift from people using open source projects to open source products. And a little bit of mystery there, right? How does that happen? How do I take an open source community project, package it, put the right licensing in place to allow it to be used as a commercially supported environment within my operational environment. You know, we Boundless have done this with several different products. We now have an ecosystem of products that are all based on best-of-breed, proven open source technologies. And so the question becomes, how does that happen and how do we get there? So Jody's going to talk a little bit about what the open source licensing options are, when you should use them, and then at the end we'll talk about some Q&A. What are some questions that we as Boundless have heard from people, and what are the answers to those questions to help demystify some of this technology? Jody?
Thanks, Anthony. Can everyone hear me on this microphone okay? I just want to thank Anthony for that nice high-level overview of what we're up to here. Open source licenses are a tool, and they are a legal tool we are using in order to play this game. I'm just going to start with one of our really simple open source licenses called BSD for Berkley Standard License. This is a really simple open source license. You can see it's got 2 clauses here, and these clauses are really specific, and one thing to keep in mind here is they are about the source code. These are not licenses that are necessarily talking about money. They are, however, talking about a legal obligation. So in this case, if I'm distributing some software using this BSD license, I need to make sure that I'm also distributing the source code. So I can't just give someone a copy of the software. I have to give them the source code or the recipe so that they can make their own copy of the software. The second stipulation here is when I do distribute the software, I also need to distribute this copyright notice. The copyright is the legal tool. It's the stick that we're using to enforce the open source license. So this is how we make sure that organizations that are making use of the BSD license actually go ahead and distribute the source code, because if not, we have copyright on the source code, and there can be some legal repercussions. How do we meet that requirement? I'm going to use Apple here as an example. So Apple here is like a proprietary company, but they also make use of open source in their projects. And here's the About screen for a project called Keynote. And if I go in there, one of the screens here of their legal information just has a copy of the BSD license, and it's exactly the same as what we saw on the previous page. So if you're using open source software as part of your work, just where you've got your legal information, make sure you include a copy of these licenses for your users. So what do we actually need to do? One thing that's tricky about doing these talks is the usual answer is to say, well, it depends, because it does depend on what license the open source software is using. What we're going to do later is we're going to go through a couple of real-world examples so that I don't have to say it depends. I do want to keep in mind a little bit of a high-level view here. Different open source licenses have been created so that for different purposes. So different companies or communities or organizations will have different intentions for their source code. Here at Boundless, we tend to like the idea of using what's called permissive licenses. These place very few restrictions on what our customers can do. But we are also happy to work with what's known as protective licenses. Protective licenses have additional clauses that are primarily focused on protecting like customer or user freedoms. So as an example, protective licenses might have some languages around patents or trademarks in order to help everyone along. Protective licenses can be both weakly protective. So this is often used for libraries that are intended to mix and match with proprietary code. Strongly protective licenses require that any use of that software also maintains the same license. So these kind of form a pecking order of what licenses are compatible with each other. So I often think of BSD, which we saw earlier, as like a universal donor. If software is written in BSD, I'm able to mix and match it into any of my projects, whether they're open source or commercial. When I move over to these weakly or these protective licenses like LGP and LGPL and GPL, I actually have to pay a little bit more attention to the details. This kind of begs the question of which license do you want to choose? Permissive licenses are really focusing on a long game for success. So they're making the bet that open source software is going to be used everywhere, far and wide. And what's going to keep people taking part in the community and supporting that open source project is that if you take a copy of the source code and you don't stay along for the ride and you're not upgrading, it's going to be expensive for you to do that upgrade in 5 or 10 years' time. Whereas protected licenses focus a bit more on a shorter game. They're saying up front, you must maintain an open source license from day one. What I like to recommend is play smart. Choose an appropriate license that for the technology or for the market that you're trying to work in. So a lot of the web development tends to favor permissive licenses such as BSD, whereas a lot of the server software likes to work with GPL and protected licenses. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some specific licenses. Open source licenses that we work with have all been reviewed by what's called the Open Source Initiative. This is an organization that goes through, has a legal team that reviews open source licenses and confirms that they actually meet the spirit of what's happening here. The different licenses are going to balance what freedoms they grant users and how they protect the software developers. There's a website here, choosealicense.com, which can help guide you through what license you might want to work with. As I mentioned earlier, BSD is kind of a universal donor, originally from Berkley University. As we saw, it only restricts the having that notice about both providing the open source and providing that copyright information. Your own work, like your website or your own software, remains completely unaffected. So this makes BSD a really excellent choice for web development, and it's the license we use for our OpenLayers JavaScript library that's used to visualize GIS data. Apache license is very similar to BSD. It's one of these permissive licenses. It includes additional languages about patents, and it provides really clear instructions for how to use this in both open source and proprietary settings. Next up, we've got GPL. GPL is one of the more popular open source licenses, especially historically. If we look at software that's been created in the last couple of years, you'll see that it's starting to favor more of the permissive licenses. This one has the idea that any modification made to the original application must be provided to the people that are running the application. This is going to be a very crucial difference as we see later in our questions and examples. This is the license we use for our GeoServer component, which is a middleware application we use to publish maps. GPL is also the license used by Oracle for the Java language. And this other one we've got here is the lesser GNU public license. This is a library that's primarily used in the scientific community. And it is a very business-friendly license, able to be mixed and matched with proprietary code. It does require that any changes you make to the library are provided to people that are running the library, but your own work, it has no restrictions on your own work. Okay, just going to pause here, make sure Anthony's ready. So I'm going to go through some examples of how we can mix open source and proprietary code. What I'm thinking here with proprietary code is when you've made your own customizations or extensions to an open source project, and that work belongs to you, and we're exploring what you can do with your proprietary code. So for our permissive licenses, use with proprietary code is absolutely fine. There's no additional restrictions that are going to be placed on you. For the weekly protected licenses like LGPL, we're going to have to pay a little bit of attention to what's going on. If you make any fixes to the original library, your customer needs to have a copy of those fixes as well. A really easy way to make sure your customer has a copy to those fixes is to give them back to the open source community that produced the library. But you can also just wait for your customer to ask, and you can send them a copy via email or a DVD. to meet that legal requirement. And then strongly protected licenses, both the original work and your own work is going to have to make use of that same license. So you've got a couple options there. If you've got a restriction that prevents you from sharing your code with everybody on the internet, you can always run the software on your own hardware internally, because the license only applies to the people that are running the software. The other thing you can do is you can start to separate out your code base. So you might provide people with a client they can use, and that client can talk to software that's running back on a server that you control.
So what we've done with our software, as I noted before, we have an entire ecosystem built upon open source. In the case of Boundless Suite, one of the pieces of software, one of our products, right, our finished, polished products, it actually leverages 4 different libraries. It actually leverages a few more, but they're not as important for what we're talking about today. But you can see that those individual open source projects, OpenLayers, GeoServer, GeoWebCache, PostGIS, GeoTools, and WebSDK, all have individual open source licenses themselves. But because of the careful choice in which languages, which licenses are being used, we have the ability to mix and match them together, package them together, and provide them as a single packaged product that people can then use in an operational environment. The same is true for Boundless Desktop, right? Our desktop GIS product. It again uses several different projects, but because there was a careful choice in which licenses were chosen for those projects, we are legally able to combine them all together, provide them to you as a single product, so that you're able to be productive and work in your operational environment. So what does all this mean? There's a lot of legalese, a lot of talk, a lot of different licenses. How does this apply to me? I always joke, so what, who cares, right? What we've done is Jody and I over the last few years, we've gotten lots of questions from people who just, I get open source, I get that there's different licenses, but what does it mean to me? So we've put some of the most common questions together onto the next few slides to help you guys understand when it's appropriate to use open source and when it's not, or how do I use it in this case, or how do I not? So the first question related to a change in GeoServer itself, like the actual project from geoserver.org. There was an organization, they wanted to create an extension to GeoServer to allow it to do something that it didn't necessarily do before. But they don't want to change any of the underlying code itself. So I want to extend the project, but I don't want to actually change the core project that I'm building the extension on top of. Am I obligated to share those changes, the extension that I've made, back to the core GeoServer community?
And the answer here is that no, you're under no obligation to share that work back to the internet, back to the community. You are required to share those changes, that extension, with your customer. And in this case, I mean specifically the customer that is running the copy of GeoServer that you produced. So I just need to be very clear. This applies to the sysadmin that is running the software, not necessarily clients that are visiting the website externally. This is specifically for that sysadministrator.
And just provide a little bit of context. The organization who asked to make this change were a military organization who were on a closed network off the internet. So their fear was, if I develop a custom extension to allow it to talk to data that I can't share with the rest of the world, do I have to share that custom extension out with the rest of the world? Because that would defeat the purpose of what we're trying to do. And so the answer, again, as Jody said, is no. But you do have to share it with the sysadmin on your closed system if they ask for it. Right. The next question is related to OpenLayers, so a web application. My company would like to make a closed web application built using this open source library. Can I then sell that closed application for a fee? So can I leverage the open source library and build an application that I can turn around and make money off of?
And the answer is yes. OpenLayers uses the BSD license, which is a permissive license. And so you really are welcome to mix and match these open source JavaScript libraries into your final website or product that you're selling to customers. This is one of the reasons why BSD is a good license choice for websites and web applications.
And this was a consulting company here in the US who basically wanted to take the library, build their own website to be able to sell to others. Next question relates to Boundless Suite, sort of the server-side product that does a lot of the publishing of geospatial data. My organization would like to create a GeoServer process that integrates with our billing system, so internally. And then we're going to have an OpenLayers powered web application that sits on top of that. Once I create that, am I obligated to share that website, all the work that went into it, the code itself, with our website's visitors? In other words, I made a website, people are going to go to it. Do I have to share all that source code with every visitor that comes to that website?
And in this case, we've got two pieces of software in the mix. So the OpenLayers BSD library is going to be used by those website visitors. It is placing no restrictions on the use of that library, so you've got no obligation to share that with your website visitors. Now, GeoServer does have a restriction, but it only applies to that sysadmin, which is going to be running that software on your network. And so the users of this GeoServer application is that sysadmin. It's not the website visitor. The sysadmin is the person responsible for running that software, which is providing a service for the website. One reason why we want to make sure that that sysadmin has access to the source code is they might need to perform their own security audit, and there's lots of automated tools that can go through source code and check for common security problems. Yeah.
And there's a follow-on to this as well, related to the library that's the GeoTools library?
Right. Okay. So one thing that's interesting here is the GeoServer application is GPL, but it makes use of a library that uses one of this lesser GPL license, and it has far fewer restrictions. So one way to extend GeoServer is by writing GeoTools is used for all the rendering and the data access. So you would be able to write a custom renderer to draw icons exactly the way you want. Or you might be able to write a custom data store, it's called, to teach GeoServer how to work with your data and your organization's information. And once again, that's nothing that you have to give to your website visitors. But in this case, because of the terms of that LGPL license, you don't even have to share that with your sysadmin who's running it internally.
Last one came from a partner of Boundless who's exploring SaaS offerings, software as a service. They wanted to host a version of our software and then have users come and kind of integrate or access that use. And they basically said, look, we're using GeoServer as part of a SaaS strategy. We've added an extension to monitor what our customers are doing, how often they're accessing maps and data, and keeping tabs on who, what, when, and where. In this particular case, are there any restrictions on what we can or cannot do?
Yeah. So in this case, the customers in this case are, once again, website visitors. They're not directly responsible for the hardware that's running this GeoServer application. Even though they're going to configure this application with their own data and publish their own information, they are not the person who's directly responsible for that hardware. So we're under no obligation to share this custom monitoring extension with those customers. You can imagine why you'd want a custom monitoring extension in this scenario, because chances are that the users are being charged based on how much they're using the service.
And then quite popularly, a lot of folks build plugins or extensions to QGIS, right? The Boundless Desktop, the desktop side GIS. So my organization created a custom plugin. Again, this was a defense customer who couldn't share a lot of their information back with the world. They work on a closed network. If I build a custom plugin related to closed work, do I have to give that to the general public or contribute that back to the QGIS project or program?
And in this case, it's about the people who are running the software, so you're not required to share this plugin, the source code for it, back with the public at large. You are obliged to make sure the people that are running that software, in your internal network in this case, are able to access a copy of the source code. This is especially important for plugins that are doing a lot of careful analysis. People might want to go through and check the algorithms and some of the data science behind what's being used.
And then a question about royalties. An agency in Australia asked, if I create a closed solution on top of open source, am I required to pay royalties back to those open source communities?
Mm-hmm. In this case, I just want to remind everyone that open source is a legal tool we're using to enable a lot of these business models. they are really specifically focused on the source code and don't make mention of royalties. Now, so in this case, there's no kind of royalties that are due back to the community, but some communities will make use of patents or trademarks in order to cover some aspects of their product that are not covered by the open source license. So the open source licenses are about the source code. It does not completely close the door to things like using the trademark of QGIS or any patents that are associated with things. So we have had a case in GeoTools where someone has contributed, it was a toolbar or something that was patented, and we had to remove it from the library because we didn't want to expose our users to any danger of a patent infringement.
And then a little bit of an aside about copyrights, patents, and trademarks, just kind of what they are and how they're different. We won't go into details here in the essence of time, but again, it'll be available in our presentation at the end. Here's an example of the QGIS trademark, just again so you can see how it's being used. It is packaged with the software. I don't know if you want to add anything to that. But.
Not especially. The QGIS community took out a trademark on their name because a company had commercially set up operations with their name, taking advantage of their popularity.
And then we have an organization who wanted to take some of the workshop material, the training material that we have freely and publicly available on our website, and they wanted to create their own training course based on the training material we provided for free. Can I do that? And then can I turn that around and sell that training for a fee?
And this answer here is interesting. We're all familiar with citing work in academic context. There are what's called open document licenses, and our workshop material we publish using a license called Creative Commons. Creative Commons licenses gives authors some of the same freedoms we enjoy here with our open source licenses for programmers and developers. So specifically, because we're publishing this as a Creative Commons license, people do have permission to download, remix, and sell a workshop based on our material, but the license asks that they tell their customers, hey, we got this material from Boundless.
And again, you can kind of see in our documentation, we do mention the Creative Commons license on the left here. And if you were to go out and look, you see that, again, it allows you to do certain things like share it with others, allow them to modify that base content, as long as they provide attribution back to Boundless.
So just a final wrap up here on how we respect open source licenses. Boundless does ship products to our customers, and as part of our end user license agreement, we've got a little clause here saying, hey, we're using a bunch of these open source components. Anything we say here in our end user license agreement is subservient to the respective open source licenses. So this isn't very interesting. It's more a technicality of how we make this happen.
And for more information, I know we're right at time, we've posted a couple blog posts on our website for you to kind of dig deeper into this and read more about it. Jody and I are certainly here for the rest of the day today. We'd love to talk to you if you have specific questions, but certainly the blog is a good resource for more and additional information. So with that, we thank you, and we yield our time to the rest of the floor.
Thank you.